Have you noticed that when someone hurts you or causes pain, they don't just hurt you and they don't just take your peace, but they also start to take your attention? It seems like all of your attention starts to flow toward that person. Your thoughts, your energy, your emotions, your actions, your reactions. And that person then becomes a pretty prominent figure in your mind and in your life. You'll replay conversations that you've had with that person, arguments that you didn't have, things that you thought you should say but you didn't say, things that the ways that you should have acted but you didn't act, and before long something really, really strange happens. Not only have they hurt you, but now they are possessing a very critical and important space in your life. They're taking your attention. What I want to talk about here is, how do you forgive someone without losing yourself? Because forgiveness is a difficult topic for sure, a misunderstood topic. But how do you forgive someone without losing yourself? Because there is a real tragedy. There's a real tragedy when we don't forgive, and that is that offense begins to shape the person we become. So, in essence, my inability to forgive is a choice that I make to be shaped by another person. That's the tragedy. The tragedy that's on the other side of not forgiving when someone has wronged you. You know, forgiveness is not really about pretending that it didn't happen. That's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not letting them off the hook, as some probably think and even feel. But forgiveness is not about excusing what they did either, because sometimes there's just no excuse at all for what they have done. It's not about saying that everything's okay. Forgiveness is really about refusing to lose yourself in that offense. Refusing to define yourself by someone else's choices. Now, we can't control another person. We can't control what they think, what they say, what they do, how they react. And sometimes their actions and their reactions cause hurt and pain in our lives. And so part of forgiveness, or I should say a benefit of forgiveness that benefits you when you forgive someone else, part of that benefit is that you are saying about that other person, I'm not going to allow you to shape who I become. And I think that's one of the things about forgiveness that we don't talk about a lot. You know, we talk about maybe the command to forgive, the importance of forgiveness, but there's also a personal reason that we forgive. And that personal reason is, I don't want to allow someone else and their actions, destructive cycles, to shape the person that I become. I want to become the person that God has designed me to become. And as we're migrating through life, we interact with people that cause us pain, that cause us harm. And at that point, we've got a choice. The choice is, am I going to forgive and become the person that God has designed me to become? Or am I going to hold on to unforgiveness and allow the person that wronged me to shape the person that I become? So how do you forgive somebody and not lose yourself? You know, when someone hurts you, we immediately move into control mode. Have you noticed that? As soon as they hurt, as soon as they inflict offense or wound, we move into control mode. We want to control the outcome. We want to control the response. We want to control the revenge. We want to control the reconciliation. We want to control, whether they understand what they did or not. We want to control whether they apologize or not. And that's kind of a defense mechanism that's specific to all of us. I mean, if you're a human being, when you receive injury or offense or hurt or pain, you slip into this control mode wherein you want them to see what they did. You want them to recognize the damage that they did. You want them to reconcile with you. It's like I said a moment ago, when somebody hurts you, they take your peace, but that doesn't have to be permanent. It can be temporary. Them taking your peace is temporary when you forgive, because when you forgive, you're saying, I'm not going to allow you to determine and shape who I'm going to become as a person. So you have to know about this process, though. When they damage you, the first thing that you do is go into control mode. You have to recognize that about yourself if you're going to process, the pain that's been inflicted on you. If you're honest, you're going to see that a lot of the emotional energy that you dispense becomes focused on that person, the person that did something to you, and you want them to change. That's what you want. You want them to change. I want you to take it back. And so we begin to rationalize it, and we say things like, if they could just see what they did, if they could just understand what they did, if they could just change and acknowledge, what they did, then I will have peace. But here's the problem. If that's the case, your peace will always be tied to somebody else's behavior. When we're hurt, we slip into control mode, and we want to control the outcome. We want to control their recognition, acknowledgement, admitting it, and all that stuff. And when they do that, we rationalize, justify this to ourselves, and we say, when they do these things, then I will have peace again. And inevitably, you're tying your peace to somebody else's behavior. And that is an incredibly dangerous place for you to be, because if your peace is depending on somebody else's behavior, your peace is always going to be changing. You're never really going to have peace of mind. You're never really going to have peace of heart, because that person and their actions are still going to control you, because you've tied your peace to their behavior. Now, most people think that, unforgiveness is really about anger, and sometimes it is about anger, but oftentimes it's deeper than just anger. Someone did something to me, so I'm angry about it, and I slip into control mode, and I try to control the outcome to make it right. But a lot of times, the pain that they inflict on me is deeper than just anger. What they really challenge in me is my identity. Who am I? And at this point, you begin to define yourself by what happened. You define yourself by that experience, by that pain, that damage, that trauma. And that is the thing that you have to recognize about yourself, is that you begin to identify yourself with that trauma. Instead of thinking, I am fearfully and wonderfully made by God. I am uniquely and purposefully designed by God, and that happened to me. But that thing that happened to me, that relationship that went sideways, does not define who I am. Forgiveness allows me to step back from it and say, I'm not going to allow it to define or shape the person that I become. And if we're honest, a lot of us look back at the trauma in our lives and we have been shaped by it, and we're harboring unforgiveness. And we think it's anger when we think of the person. We think this is wrong, and we have anger toward them. But really, underneath, it's about identity. Underneath, it's who am I becoming? Who am I? When you experience betrayal or rejection or abandonment or injustice, those things don't feel good. They don't feel good at all, and they have a way of challenging who we are and who we're becoming. So instead of becoming who God has designed me to become, or at least exploring the concept of who God has designed me to become, I allow that event or that experience or that relationship to start dictating to me who I am. And so that's the reason forgiveness is so powerful, because forgiveness disconnects you from that event. Forgiveness says, I'm not going to allow that event, that person, that circumstance, that thing that happens to define who I am becoming. So think about it. What they did hurt you. It hurt you deeply. And now you're allowing that moment to shape the person you're becoming by not forgiving. So the offense now becomes the lens through which you see the world and all other relationships. This happens a lot in betrayal or rejection. If you've been betrayed in a relationship and it's undealt with, meaning it's unresolved, you have not forgiven. Now, again, we can't control the other person reconciling with us, but we can forgive. But we choose not to forgive. We choose to hold on to it. Well, now that thing festers. It festers inside of us, and it becomes the lens through which we view other people that didn't do anything to us at all. So there have been occasions where betrayal has happened in your life, and now, because that's unresolved, because you've chosen to not forgive, it's challenged your identity and it's now shaping who you are. You now look at other people who have done nothing wrong to you, and you look at them suspiciously, like they're going to betray me too. And it's all because of this other relationship that's unresolved. And when I say unresolved, I mean on your side. Remember, forgiveness is unilateral. It's something between you and God. It's something that happens in your heart. Reconciliation is bilateral. It's between you and the other person. And reconciliation may never happen. The other person may never acknowledge the wrong and the damage and the hurt and the pain that they have inflicted on you. But that doesn't keep you from forgiving, from untethering yourself to that situation as a defining moment in your life. It doesn't have to be a defining moment unless you choose for it to be a defining moment. But if you've experienced that kind of rejection or betrayal or abandonment and it's unresolved, then you look at the other relationships in your life through that same lens. See, that's the side effect of unforgiveness that we don't really ever talk about. And this is exactly why forgiveness is so necessary. It's not because the person deserves it. I mean, for crying out loud, the person did something wrong. They don't deserve forgiveness. You don't extend forgiveness to people who deserve it. You extend forgiveness so that you can have peace. You extend forgiveness so that you can continue to become the person that God has intended for you to become. So the question that we really need to ask at this point is, do you deserve the freedom to become the person God intended for you to become? Do you deserve that freedom? Well, if you say, yes, I deserve that freedom, then forgiveness is the pathway that gets you to that freedom. Now, there's a real shift here that takes place if this is the case. If we're moving forward with this idea, there's a real shift. As I said a moment ago, a lot of times they take your peace because of what they've done, and then they begin to take your attention. And so here's the shift. Usually, toward the person who has wronged me, I think, how can I make them different? How can I change them? How can I create an environment where they will see their wrong, come to their senses, and we can reconcile? Again, they've taken your peace, now they're taking your attention. The real question has nothing to do with them, the perpetrator of the wrong, of the hurt, of the pain. It has to do with you. So instead of asking the question, how do I make them different? You ask the question, who do I want to become? Life is, it ebb and flows. It comes, it goes, and things come into our lives, things come out of our lives. And the question that undergirds all of it and kind of drives us through life is, who am I becoming? And you get to make that choice. Who do I become? I want to become the person that God has designed for me to become. Well, if that is the case, then you're going to forgive. Now, I know this is difficult, but one of these keeps your attention on the other person, and the other one places the responsibility back on the person who is really the center of this, and it's you. Because you get to choose this. I mean, ultimately, you can't control their choices. You can't control their actions, their reactions, their character, their honesty, their growth, their repentance, their reconciliation. You can't control any of that. You cannot control it. And trying to control it is exhausting you. Exhausting you. You have no peace because you're trying to control another person. And by trying to control them and their responses, you're actually shaping the person that you're becoming. When forgiveness would release you from that. Forgiveness would garner back your peace, because forgiveness is saying, I'm not going to be defined by that moment. You see how it's about identity? I'm not going to be defined by that moment or that relationship or that pain. And throughout Scripture, Jesus continually redirected people inward. Jesus very rarely directed people outward. He never told his people to control other people. He never did that. You think about the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I mean, if you go back and read those 3 chapters and just as a cursory reading of that, you're going to see that he directs people inward, like evaluating yourself, looking at yourself, not controlling others, but examining yourself. And this doesn't mean that other people's behavior doesn't matter, because other people's behavior does matter, but it does not matter in who you're becoming. What matters in who you're becoming is your character. And you get to determine who you're going to become. Are you going to be shaped by the pain, by the trauma, or are you going to forgive and become the person that God wants you to be? So instead of asking the question, what kind of person are they becoming? That's control mode. We start to ask the question, what kind of person am I becoming? Am I becoming more bitter because this happened? Am I becoming more cynical because this happened? Am I becoming more suspicious because this happened? Am I becoming the type of person that pushes people away instead of pulls people toward me? Am I becoming a hard-hearted person? Am I becoming cold toward other people? What kind of person am I becoming? Or am I becoming a gracious person? Am I becoming a patient person, a wise person, a person that's more grounded, a person that's more stable? Because every wound that happens to you creates a fork in the road. It creates a choice. Every ebb and flow of life, painful thing that comes in, painful thing that goes out, creates a fork in the road. So pain is going to shape you, but you get to determine how it shapes you. You can use your pain to grow into the person you want to become, or you can use your pain to be controlled by the person who hurt you. The only question is how. And I can imagine what some of you are thinking. Forgiveness feels unfair, doesn't it? It feels unfair to me. I mean, it feels like I'm surrendering. It feels like I'm okay with what they did. Like I don't care about right and wrong. I don't care about justice. I don't care. Like I'm okay with what you did to me. And that's just a bad place to be. That's what forgiveness feels like. It feels like the other person is winning or the other person is getting away with something. If we're honest, that's the way, forgiveness feels. And I think that's the reason we resist it. Because we trust what it feels like instead of what it actually is. And I think this is kind of the separation of this is what I feel like forgiveness is, and this is the fact of forgiveness. What I've been explaining to you is the facts of forgiveness. Now, the thing that will prevent you from believing what I'm saying to you is your feelings. This is the way you feel about forgiveness. If I forgive them, then they'll get away with it. That's how I feel. I'm certain that you're just as human as me. That's probably the way you feel too. But forgiveness is not releasing them from God's justice. Forgiveness is releasing them from your justice. That's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is untethering yourself from that person and the repayment from that person for what they did to you. That's forgiveness. Forgiveness is saying, God, I entrust myself to you because you're the one who judges justly. So forgiveness is releasing yourself from carrying God's job. It's not your job to make all things or all wrong things right. That's his job. You weren't designed to carry vengeance. You weren't designed to carry justice. You weren't designed to carry, constant resentment and unforgiveness. You weren't designed that way. Your system cannot carry the emotional weight of making things right. It's way too heavy. You can't do that. You weren't made that way. And it is crushing you. It is crushing you to carry the emotional weight of trying to make all things right. Now, I think this is important because we're talking about how to forgive and not lose yourself. Well, part of that is understanding the process that happens when we are wronged, the process by which we get to forgiveness. But the other part is understanding that we can't carry God's job. Forgiveness is forgiveness doesn't mean access. I forgive somebody, therefore I give them access. Forgiveness, some people need boundaries. Forgiveness doesn't mean trust. If there's been mistrust, it's going to take time to rebuild trust. But rebuilding trust and forgiving are two different things. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Because, as I've said to you a number of times, reconciliation is two people. Forgiveness is only one. It's just you. Forgiveness doesn't mean that you pretend that everything's okay or it's just water under the bridge. No, it's not. It's not water under the bridge. That's just an old adage that really doesn't help. It's just water on the bridge. No, it has to be processed emotionally and spiritually. And the spiritual cure for this is forgiveness. So what is forgiveness? I want to give you just a working definition of forgiveness. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness is I don't expect another human being to make me whole. Now, when forgiveness comes up, it's because somebody has taken something from me. It's that they've done something to me, and I feel loss. I feel broken. And I look at the person and go, you broke me. But the truth is, I was broken long before that person entered my life. That's the reason that you need the gospel. It's the reason that you need Christ is because you're broken. So a person can't break me. If a person can break me, then they can make me. But since they didn't make me, they can't break me. So forgiveness is me saying, I don't expect you to make me whole. And I release you from the obligation to make me whole. And I release you from the expectation of repayment for the wrong that you've done me. That's forgiveness. And a number of other things happen then. I don't expect that person to make me whole. I feel lost, but I've got to process the feeling of lost and come to the fact, this is the person I want to become, and I'm not going to be shaped by this. And at that point, I'm making a decision to be shaped into the person that God wants me to be. So I'm not looking at the other person and trying to control their response to me or their repayment to me or them making me whole. I'm forgiving them. I'm releasing them from that. See, that's unilateral. It's just between me and the Lord. It's in my heart. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. Forgiveness doesn't mean trust. Some relationships need boundaries. Boundaries doesn't mean that I haven't forgiven you. I've forgiven you, but I've put up boundaries because I see your destructive behavior. Forgiveness doesn't mean rebuilding trust. Sometimes relationships require distance. Forgiveness it doesn't mean pretending. Some situations require wisdom. It doesn't require me pretending. You can completely forgive somebody and still recognize that they are very unsafe. They're very destructive. So the goal is not to pretend like nothing happened. The goal is to ensure that the wound caused by the person doesn't shape me into the person that I don't want to become. And that's a real challenge. It's a real challenge because one of the greatest moments in healing on this forgiveness journey or process is realizing that I don't need them to change in order for me to forgive. I no longer need their apology for me to forgive. I don't need an explanation. I don't need validation. I don't need a justification or a rationale for why they did what they did. I don't need them to admit they did it. I don't need closure. I don't need all those things that I thought would give me my peace back. I don't need any of those things. Now, it's not because those things wouldn't be nice. All those things would be great, but I don't need them in order to regain my peace. I've now realized that my future doesn't depend on them and their behavior. That's forgiveness. Forgiveness is saying my future and the person I become does not or is not determined by what you did to me. You realize that your life is far too short and far too valuable to leave it in the hands of somebody else who has already hurt you once. So at this point, you're very free. Because forgiveness is about me to you. So I stopped waiting for them to change. I stopped waiting for them to apologize or admit it to me. I stopped waiting and obsessing and replaying it in my mind over and over. I stopped chasing them, wanting reconciliation, and I began to move forward. I moved forward into becoming the person that God wanted me to be. I can forgive you and not lose myself. Unforgiveness is when you lose yourself. And see, that's the heart of forgiveness. Yes, you're commanded to forgive, and yes, it is an obligation, an expectation of believers. But hopefully, you're kind of starting to see that forgiveness affects me. Forgiveness deeply affects me. Forgiveness is not about making excuses for them. Forgiveness is not letting them off the hook or minimizing what they've done. Forgiveness is me making a choice. I'm making a choice that the people who hurt me do not get the final vote on who I become. I'm making the choice that the people who betrayed me do not get the final vote on who I become. I'm making a choice that the people who rejected me don't get the final vote on who I become. I'm consciously making the decision that God alone is going to determine the person I become, and the pathway by which He does that is forgiveness. When you forgive somebody, you're not saying it didn't matter. When you forgive somebody, you're saying, I'm not going to allow this to determine who I become as a person. There's a big difference there. Maybe someday the person who hurt you deeply will apologize. Maybe they won't. Maybe they never apologize. Maybe they never change. Maybe they never will. But their refusal to change does not in any way, shape, or form become the reason for me not growing. They don't get to determine my growth into the person that God has designed me to be. And so their offense doesn't have to become my identity. Forgiveness is the moment that I take my identity back. I can forgive you and not lose myself. It's the moment that I stop asking them to determine who I'm going to become. And I want to leave you with this last idea because I think it challenges the very core of what we think about forgiveness. Forgiveness is not letting them off the hook. Forgiveness is refusing to let them become the person who determines who I become as a person.